wanted to welcome all of you to the Reshoring, Nearshoring, and Friendshoring webinar. Thank you very much for registering. My name is Tom Dustman. I'm a member of the National Association of District Export Councils Governing Council, and I co-chair the Education and Outreach Committee with my partner, Shariah Johnson. And at today's webinar, after my introduction, Tom Cook, our presenter, has asked that if you have questions during the webinar, you can use the chat box, and Shariah will be monitoring the chat box and will present those questions to Mr. Cook. Again, as I mentioned, Shariah and I are members, as well as Tom Cook, as we're all members of the governing council for the National Association of District Export Councils. And you can find our calendar of events at the National Association of District Export Councils website. And when you get to the landing page, if you look in the upper right, you'll find an events button. And if you press the events button, you'll be able to see a series of webinars and other topics that would be available. We are recording this webinar, and again, we look forward to your questions and make this interactive and valuable. So with this brief introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Tom Cook, and Tom, you can provide your own bio. So thank you very much, Tom, and we appreciate your presentation today.
Right. So thank you, Tom, Shariah, and Heidi for setting the event up. And before I get into the subject matter at hand, I just want to mention that the NADEC, the National Association of District Export Councils, is an accumulation of locally placed district export councils, which are all over the United States and most of the major cities that we all work in. They are set up into 8 different regions, including Alaska and Hawaii. And the importance of making this point to you is that these people who work in the export councils, both at the local level and also at the national level, are actually volunteer people who are involved in global trade, both importing and exporting. And they are a volunteer resource for everybody who's involved in global trade. And you can reach out to us, and we've been more than happy to answer your questions and provide you direction and help you access a lot of the resources, of which the Department of Commerce, who we're kind of part of as a volunteer organization from the Department of Commerce, they're also a significant resource of information, not only here in the United States, but all over the world, where they have commercial attachés located to help us in communicating to local parties, both companies that are looking to buy our products and companies that are looking to do business here in the United States. So have that always in mind, that NADEC is actually a great resource for you and the local U.S. export assistance centers. I just want to check with my crew that they can see the presentation, that I'm up and running. Yes, to my group, you can see that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the company that I represent, Blue Tiger International, we're consultants in global supply chain. We basically help companies navigate all the challenges that are involved in international business. We work on cost, risk, business process, and expanding both the sourcing of products internationally and the selling of products internationally on the export side. So why we're even having this conversation is that there's a critical factor involved with the concept of nearshoring, which it impacts the national security of the United States as part of the whole factor of the U.S. government feeling the vulnerabilities, particularly felt through COVID, that we need to really source some certain key products and certain key materials here in the United States. Secondly, it clearly reduces the risk and the cost in the global supply chain. And lastly, it creates models for us of sustainability in our global operations. And though this is a hot topic currently, this whole concept of looking at where we source from and diversifying our sourcing portfolios is something that goes back for the entire realm of my career, which goes back more than 30 years. So one of the things to look at when we think about sourcing globally is why even go down that path? And one of the reasons is that we have to, because there are certain products that are not available to us in the United States. There are product lines that have completely left manufacturing and the industrialization here in the United States and has gone elsewhere. And as most of us know, a lot of that has gone to China. Another factor is cost. As labor costs increased in the United States, as all kinds of industrial and environmental standards were put into place here in the United States, we became a reasonably higher expense area to manufacture certain types of products. So a lot of that was sent overseas to lower cost markets, of which China jumped into the fray after Nixon opened it up in the middle of the 70s and really took off in the middle of the 1980s. And to even this date, while there is some regression in that market, it's still an expanding market globally. A lot of companies like to diversify their sourcing portfolio, and even having all your manufacturing done here in the United States creates a certain amount of risk. So a lot of companies have looked for balancing their portfolio and having sourcing come from a number of different countries in the global market. And one of the things that happened as a result of the COVID the last 3 years is risk management has entered into the supply chain mindset. And it's caused a lot of companies to think about how it sells its products overseas, as also where it sources its products overseas, and create more of a diversified portfolio, really reducing the risk and not focusing on cost as a major factor, but balancing it off between the risks that are involved as well as the costs that are involved. So, as I mentioned, nearshoring is a very hot topic now. Just in our own business model, if I'd been back 5 years ago, we would probably be doing 2, maybe 3 nearshoring programs a quarter. We're now doing probably 4 or 5 a month now here in the United States. And a lot of that has to do with the impact of the COVID and the residual impact, which is that a lot of companies felt significantly vulnerable as the delays of goods coming into the United States, as well as the cost associated that occurred during that period. We also know that there's a lot of concern over the dependency that a lot of companies have on China. Okay. And a lot more companies are building what we call landed cost management into their supply chain. And we'll take a look at that in more detail in a moment. And again, I want to reiterate that if anybody has a question at any point or a comment, or they want to challenge anything that I've said, you're more than welcome to just go into the chat box and Shariah will interrupt me to address that question. So politically, and the geopolitical world that we look at, we have to look at a number of things which are happening right today. We've been dealing with the Ukraine-Russia conflict for over a year and a half now. As most of us clearly know, in the last 3 weeks, we have a serious problem that's developed in the Middle East, where the Hamas attacked Israel, and now that Israel is massing a significant military capability to basically, their intention is to take Hamas out. And obviously the concern there is that that conflict could be spreading to a much wider area in the Middle East, where a number of organizations aligned with Hamas might enter into the fray. And as you probably also are aware, is the United States has sent 3 carrier fleets, 2 into the Mediterranean, 1 into the Red Sea, to kind of create a significant deterrence, and also obviously be available if necessary in the fact of supporting Israel. We also know that there's a significant amount of political rhetoric going on in China, North Korea. We add Russia, the Ukraine issue to that mix, as well as certain issues occurring in Latin America. It's all these disruptions that represent instability, represents uncertainty, okay, and it allows the whole concept of bringing back manufacturing either closer to the United States or back to the United States creates a much more sustainable and potentially risk management option. So this is a very busy slide. It's intended that way because over the years, we've developed actually 15 solutions for companies to manage their landed costs, both on import and export activity. And depending upon how much time we have towards the end of the presentation, I'll go through a number of these, but you'll see in the center is this alternative and near sourcing option, which is really the focus of this conversation. So near sourcing, if we looked at the definition in the commercial world today, is really creating a circumstance where our sourcing of materials, components, parts, and finished products are brought closer to where they are sold. And specifically, we have three categories in this area. The first is reshoring, which is bringing back manufacturing to the United States. And the Department of Commerce puts out statistics, and somewhere it's represented about 3 to 4% in the last 3 years has already come back to the United States against what happened in prior years. Bringing back manufacturing closer to the United States, such as in Mexico, Canada, or the Caribbean, as an example, would be called nearshoring. And friendshoring is bringing it to allied countries such as Taiwan, Malaysia, Turkey, South Korea, or Vietnam, and there's a host of other countries that would be included in that mix. So I'm going to use the term near sourcing, but understand that near sourcing really has to be further defined in these three categories of reshoring and friendshoring as well. So we're into this circumstance, particularly as a hot topic today, because of the vulnerability that was created, particularly during COVID, on the dependence on China. And many of you may be fully aware of how difficult it was to get certain products out, not only timely out of China, but also the costs that were involved, not only in the purchase price of the merchandise, the acquisition cost, but also in moving it to the United States. A 40-foot container coming out of China going into the central United States in end of 2019 might have cost the company around $2,500, $2,600. That same container in December of 2021 could have cost as much as $25,000 or 10 times as much to bring that same container in. And what might have typically been a 120 to 130-day cycle of purchase through delivery, that cycle could have gone to 270, 360 days. So that concern that came through COVID has caused a lot of companies to rethink where its dependence is in the supply chain. And appreciate the fact that the instability that happened was on a global basis. So while it was personified in China, okay, just about anywhere in the world, we saw an increase in costs and a transportation infrastructure that wasn't very responsive and highly costly, okay? And because of that instability, it caused a tremendous amount of uncertainty that we all had to deal with and try to navigate in our supply chain responsibilities. Also appreciate the fact that the vulnerability that was created was central to a number of products that have a significant critical dependence here in the United States. Raw ingredients for the manufacturing of defense equipment, raw materials and components that are used in commercial manufacturing of medical products, all types of minerals and chemicals used in the manufacturing of various medicinal and pharmaceutical products. That clearly there was a vulnerability when we aren't able to get these not only in the quantities needed, but also in the time frame that was required. So the Congress and Senate has now established committees looking at that exposure and that vulnerability. And the big concern that we have in the commercial side of the world is that they're going to create mandates and legislation, okay, and mandate that a certain percentage of certain product lines and certain verticals, certain components, raw materials, and so forth, be brought back either to the United States or in that nearshoring or friendshoring circumstance. So when we look at the benefits of near sourcing, we find that it can potentially minimize the impact of the delay. It impacts the percentage of cost increases, and it helps dampen down the uncertainty that we face through COVID. And we like to use the word that it creates potentially a more sustainable supply chain model. In the examples of the companies that we've moved back to the United States or moved to other countries, it creates them having an ability to better manage their safety stock. And appreciate the fact that, you know, the concept of lean manufacturing and just-in-time inventory kind of went out the window through COVID, and companies were just happy to get inventory in at any cost. Okay, so the concept of safety stock changed dramatically, and there's a residual impact which still exists today. Most companies, while they're trying to get back to some level of leaner manufacturing and better just-in-time inventory, are really still carrying a significantly larger amount of safety stock than they ever did previously. And obviously, bringing it closer to home will shorten the supply line. That not only impacts the timeliness of deliveries, but it also impacts the costs that are involved in those deliveries. The example being that today, an ocean freight container coming out of Asia to the West Coast of the United States might cost around $2,700, but a 40-foot tractor trailer coming up from Mexico, if that's where we were sourcing from, might only cost $1,100, you know, almost a third difference of costing model. But having said all that, there are still challenges that we have to face when we decide to go down this near sourcing hole in the ground, which is one is that change is always difficult. We work with lots of different companies all over the United States, from some of the largest Fortune 1000 companies down to mom and pop operators. And we find that a company that for the last 15 years has been sourcing in China very successfully, other than the disruption that happened in COVID. And obviously, coming out of COVID, things are starting to turn back to a much normal circumstance. And when we talk to them about creating a risk management concept in their supply chain and thinking about an alternative sourcing, a lot of the executives and the operations people that we deal with sit back and say, oh my gosh, the amount of work that would be involved in taking care of that change. So people are resistant to change just naturally. Then you have to find suitable suppliers. Every supply chain has its own nuance, its own requirements, its own set of standards, its own sets of quality control, its own set of requirements that they need from a particular supplier. So obviously you've got to go through a whole search process to find that suitable supplier. Nextly is that if you end up having to make that decision, you have to create an ROI, a return on that investment, and therefore you have to create a financial justification, and that sometimes becomes a much more difficult process to manage. And lastly is evaluating the risk management benefit, okay? And I equate this to a company that's building a warehouse or building a manufacturing or building a new corporate space. You know, they put a sprinkler system in, okay, into that building, and in their whole business career, they may never had a fire in their warehouse or their manufacturing space or their office space, but they still build that sprinkler system in because it's a risk management policy in the facility protection area. So the idea of near sourcing is like building a sprinkler system into your sourcing model, where you're building a risk management concept in that diversification and moving goods out of areas where there might be some potential economic or political discourse that would cause us concern, such as with China. And then appreciate that we have circumstances now within the last 3 weeks where we have this problem in Israel. And I heighten this because in our friendshoring circumstance, we always look to countries where we have free trade agreements. and the United States has a free trade agreement with Israel, which means that if we source a particular product or material in Israel and we now import that into the United States, it comes in duty free through that free trade agreement, and vice versa. If Israel becomes a country where we want to sell something to as an export, okay, it enters Israel duty free as well. So 9 months ago, we did a study for a high tech company based outside of Chicago, um, looking at replacing their manufacturing in China with an alternative marketplace. And after an analysis was looked at about 10 different countries, it was determined that Israel would provide a very favorable option, mainly because it was a free trade agreement country. And when those goods entered the United States, there would be no duty. When the goods were purchased in China, because the goods were subject to the 301 tariffs, the importer had to pay not only the primary 4.5% duty, but had to pay a 25% surcharge onto that transaction. So even though the acquisition cost was a little higher in Israel, the landed cost to bring it into the United States was much less. But now think about the fact that 9 months ago, the risk in Israel was very minimal, and can appreciate now that that company in Chicago is very concerned about that option that had been developed, okay, because of a political circumstance that has occurred in that marketplace. Right now, that facility is protected and out of harm's way. But as we all know, that if this problem escalates dramatically, then that company in Chicago will have a problem. We're already preparing a plan B action in the event that happens. And plan Bs are good for all sourcing models of always looking at what if a circumstance occurs, what would be your option to potentially find additional sources.
And Tom, you don't have any questions in the chat, but as you were going, I just had a question because you mentioned option B. But would you advise companies to always have a don't keep your eggs in one basket type of mentality? I guess when it comes to manufacturing, what would you advise companies on that?
Well, one of the books that I wrote about global sourcing and purchasing, to respond to your question, I make the point that through the late '80s and '90s, there was this concept that if you focused your purchasing with one supplier, you could get your best deal, and that's a pretty valid point, which is if you focus most of your spend with one company, you can have a better opportunity to negotiate a better deal, and therefore your unit cost of purchase would come down. But obviously, a vulnerability is created if something happens with that supplier. So we sit back and say in a diversified portfolio, the concept, which what you're saying is don't put all your eggs in one basket. Okay. So the diversification model is one that now creates a risk management strategy so that you end up probably having a little bit of a higher cost, but that's balanced against a reduction in risk. So there's an up and down compromise that has to take place. We also know that in reality, there are a limited number of suppliers of certain product lines. Okay. There are a limited number of sources of certain raw materials, precious metals, particular minerals, and so forth like that. So when you do have to be forced into a situation where you do have to put all your eggs in one basket, what we then say is to raise your bar of being more diligent in your managing of that basket because of that vulnerability. And then readily have a plan B in place so that if that was to occur, what options do you have in place to play invest in some eventuality when that occurs? So I hope I answered that question for you, Shariah.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. So the whole concept of people who are involved in procurement, people who are involved in export sales, and people who have overall oversight and responsibility for either or, you have to really pay attention to the political, economic, and the social issues that are going around all over the world. And this circumstance in Israel is a perfect example of what happens when something escalates so dramatically and so quickly and the exposures that exist. Appreciate the fact that Israel owns a major steamship line, Zim line. They own and have a tremendous interest in a number of air freight companies and carriers, okay? And they're very dominant in a number of trade lanes. So if this war goes on for a lengthy time, then the whole world will be impacted by those events that occur. And appreciate the fact that the deployment of all the resources of the American military, and I'm sure the Western market will get involved with this as well, and so forth. So that will change the nature of supply chains all over the world as this develops and escalates. So we created a 4-step process, and I point this out because as you think through the whole concept of near sourcing, this is really a good strategic way of following a guideline for you to follow, which is first what we refer as an assessment, and we kind of qualify this as kind of an intellectual review of your supply chain and how it operates, not only in a current basis, but you have to go down the road with management to see strategically what plans they're developing on a 2, 3, 4, 5-year basis to make sure that as you think through your sourcing strategies, that it's not only to deal with your current set of circumstances, but what's going to be predicted down the road. Once you go through the assessment, you have to look at where your options are, okay? And we're going to look at some of the options in a few moments of some of the countries and places that we would want to look at. And then you have to create a financial model which actually creates the justification. And always appreciate that in that financial model, there's a balance between risk and cost, okay? And the key to that risk and cost balance is what I refer to as the risk tolerance of senior management. And every company has a different level of risk tolerance that they're willing to accept. So you need to have, obviously, a close connection to the ownership and the senior management of the organizations that you're working with and for, because you need to understand what their level of risk tolerance, which will change from individual to company to company. The third step, which is the operational model, which has a direct impact on purchasing, sales, customer service, and all the parties that participate in the supply chain, is what do we have to do different to make the new sourcing option work? And it might be, for example, that we have retooling expenses, or we have retooling, or we have to share, our process with a new supplier. We might have to send certain people, engineers or technicians, to their facilities to show them how to do what we need them to do in the manufacturing process, would be an example. We might have to change the carriers that we use, the modes of transit that we use, the packing, marking, labeling, all those issues might change as a result of shifting to a new supplier. And then lastly is, once we have those 3 first pillars in order, that assessment, the financial model, and the operational model, then we can move into an implementation mode. Sometimes I'm asked when I do this presentation, what length of time this could take. And it depends on the complexity in the supply chain, but it could be as short as 30 days, and it could be as long as a year, but the average is about 120 days it takes from when you start the process of assessment to when you can start an implementation program. One of the critical elements that we look at in that assessment process and in the financial model development is what we refer to as landed cost. And this is a critical area both in the import world and the export world. Now, in the export world, you might not think landed cost is that important to you, but it really determines your competitiveness of your export sale. And appreciate the fact that your buyer is doing a landed cost model in comparing you to other suppliers of that product to see what those costs are going to be. So the 5 pillars are the acquisition cost, what we pay for something, the freight to move it from point A to point B, the customs clearance process and the charges associated with that process, duties and taxes that are paid as the goods come through the border, okay? And then the domestic freight and the warehousing, fulfillment, and distribution that once goods arrive here in the United States or the country that you're potentially shipping things to, the distribution to the final end user or the customer. And appreciate the fact that depending upon where that location is located, that would dramatically impact what the costs are to move it to a final destination. Another picture in looking at this lines up all these different costs and then brings it into a category in that assessment process where we monitor, measure, and audit so that we can come up with metrics to help us define what that ROI is actually going to be. The focus to reduce our landed cost is based upon the fact that understanding the exact number of our landed cost controls our cost of goods purchased, which then has a direct impact on our cost of goods sold, which now impacts our margin, it impacts our profitability, it impacts our competitiveness, and ultimately it impacts our ability to grow and sustain our business model. Okay, one of the fallacies that we find in companies as we go into and help them review their supply chain and audit their supply chain, we ask questions like, can we see how you're doing the landed cost models? And then when we get that blank stare, when we ask that question, we realize that they're not measuring and managing their landed costs. They're only looking at the cost of acquisition. They might be looking at their cost of freight, but they're not looking at the accumulation of all the costs it takes to buy something from overseas and move it to a final destination. So as an example, in a offshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring circumstance, and even here something that's brought back to the United States, you might sit back and say, well, the acquisition cost is higher, but because we're using a free trade agreement country, the duty is eliminated, and that balances out that higher acquisition cost. Again, the cost is higher, but the freight is much less expensive, as that example I shared earlier, where you might pay $2,500 for a 40-foot container coming out of Asia, but you might only pay $1,100 for a 40-foot tractor trailer coming up from Mexico. The cost is higher, but typical delays are eliminated. The typical time frame in international trade to place an order and be able to make a delivery is in that 90 to 120 day range. Through COVID, that went to 270 to 360 days. Okay. But if we have something that's brought closer to home, okay, or in a country that we have a much more favorable working relationship with, that might lead to obviously a opportunity to deal with cost and delay. Critics of near sourcing, of which there are many, will tell you that there's costly production changeovers, the cost of tooling, the commodity costs, okay? And freight pricing can be dramatically impacted, through the whole concept of the cost that's involved. That's determined by political circumstances, as we see in Israel, the economic changes that occur that we saw through COVID, okay? And also, one of the great things about China as a manufacturing prowess, they tend to handle any volume that's required, whether it's a smaller quantity or a much greater quantity, where you have a lot of manufacturers around the world that only will handle the minimum order quantities, okay? So we have to be careful about that in that consideration. So a specific example of a challenging circumstance is we were doing a comparison of tooling, both here in the United States as compared to tooling in China and India. Comes off of a particular example in a manufacturing client that was involved in the automobile parts manufacturing. And in China and India, those tooling costs were in the neighborhood of $28,000. When we looked at here in the United States, it was as much as $105,000, almost 4 times as much. the lead time, that was required in China and India turned out to be 7 to 8 weeks. And here in the United States, when we decided to bring it back, we got a 14-week time frame, almost twice as much. Appreciate that this is unique to all different types of business models, but it has to be taken in as a consideration and something that you need to look at. But having said that, okay, I can speak to our experience here, which is that in the last 4 years, we've had more than 33 successes in moving goods, particularly out of China, okay, to nearshoring options, and that being either going to a friend location, a free trade agreement country, or coming back here to the United States. The biggest challenge that we faced in all those 33 examples that were successful was actually finding the viable alternative source, being the country which we could go to, establishing that financial justification model that needs to be done at a very granular, detailed level. And lastly, the tooling costs in many cases was much higher, or a lot of times tooling couldn't be moved from its source because of the reluctancy of a supplier losing that business. So you had to reinvent all the costs that you had already spent money on previously. So, as we all know, China is one of the big reasons and concerns that we have to this whole subject matter. So, when we look at this whole subject, we got to look at what are the issues with China. And it starts out with intellectual property rights. It's very difficult in China because of their legal system and the provincial nature of their local government controls to enforce intellectual property rights in China. You could write the tightest contract of purchase or the tightest contract of sale, okay, and there has been very few that have actually been successfully tested in China. You have the United States and the West having significant political discourse with China going on currently. And as a result, China will tell you that their sales to the West and the United States is down by 8 to 9%. I have boots on the ground in China, and based upon the outbound volume that's shipped via container, which we have the statistics for, it would say to you that it's more likely down by as much as 16 to as high as 20% down because of all the discourse and the fact that a lot of companies are reducing their dependency on China and moving away. We have a tremendous political issue that's brewing in the South China Sea in terms of who has control over it. We also have the discourse going on with Taiwan and the threats that China has in taking it back into the People's Republic of China. One of the biggest concerns that we have that has really raised its ugly head in the last 18 months is the forced labor issues. The forced labor issues go back to laws that were put in the books in the 1930s and then reinforced last year, UFLPL laws related to the Uyghur labor camps that are in the western side of China. And these basically are forced labor camps. Some refer to it as child labor, some refer to it as, forced labor circumstances, indentured servants in that part of the world. And under the Biden administration, he's created executive orders saying to U.S. Customs, Border and Protection, that they have to enforce these regulations now being social compliance issues and controls. So in the last year and a half, there's been as much as $3.5 billion of goods seized coming out of China through the United States. And customs doesn't have to have a primary reason to grab onto that product. It can be just a suspicion, okay? And it puts the requirement now on the importer to evidence that, in fact, the goods did not come from a location that was using forced labor. And they're dipping down to the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers of some of these companies that is a concern. One of the specific areas of concern is in the solar panel industry. In the making of the glass, they need a silicate. The silicate comes from sand. The sand is mined in Western China. So if you have a silicate supplier to a manufacturer in Eastern China, okay, so the manufacturing location of the actual solar panel might not have any forced labor, but if the sand comes from a mine that's in a region where there is forced labor, that presents a problem for that solar panel importer. And there are a lot of solar panels that are imported from China into the United States that are now stuck in bonded warehouses or have exited the United States to Canada or Mexico, awaiting for a resolution as to whether or not it can be evidenced that, in fact, those solar panels did not come from a manufacturing location or any of the subcontracting manufacturing locations where there was forced labor. We also have forced information transfers, and appreciate the fact that COVID is still rampant in a number of countries. China still has a problem. China has a zero tolerance lockdown policy. So if an area gets a certain degree of COVID, they lock it down. They bring in the military. Nobody's allowed to leave their homes, the businesses, the schools, all commerce is stopped in that area until they can test the area that the COVID has been dissipated. So this has been very disruptive to a lot of US companies that can't even access their own facilities when in fact their facility is in one of these areas. And I always appreciate the fact that we have tremendous amount of discourse going on politically related to China and its relationship to countries like North Korea, Russia, various African countries, and now it's coming out relative to Iran, particularly as it relates to this Israeli-Hamas problem that we are currently dealing with. Excuse me. So in terms of a policy decision and thinking about how we want to deal with China, we take the position that you never really want to necessarily eliminate China. You know, they are a successful manufacturer. They do have still low-cost manufacturing, even though the pricing has been increasing. And they have a stability of workforce, which is good. But the terminology we like to say is to reduce your footprint or your dependency on China and diversify that portfolio. Take a risk management approach and create options for you. Test those options, okay? And when you test those options, generally they're likely to produce results, meaning that you have a better, more controlled, sustainable supply chain when you tend to reduce that dependency. One of the options that you want to look at is at our southern border, the Maquiladora program that the United States has with Mexico. And the interesting backstory to this is that this is not an economic development program. It's actually an immigration strategy that was developed during the Clinton administration with Mexico, which answers the questions, how can we be, try to create a circumstance where we don't have as many of these illegal Mexican immigrants coming into the United States. And when you study that problem, one of the reasons why you had so many Mexicans coming into the United States directly related to the fact that they weren't able to find good paying middle-class jobs. So the concept of the Maquiladora was if we could create a centralized and robust manufacturing capability along the border between Mexico and the United States, where the Mexicans could work in a situation where they had a high wage, they had benefits, they had a career and an opportunity to make a good living, that they wouldn't want to come into the United States. So the program was started, and it's very successful. If you looked at the corporate 1,000 companies in the United States, more than 40% have a direct or an indirect interest in the Mexican Maquiladora program. And this is a program that creates an economic model that allows manufacturing to occur in Mexico, either by American-owned or foreign-owned or Mexican-owned companies as either primary manufacturers or contract manufacturers. and there are significant tax benefits for that company in Mexico, and appreciate that when they finish a product and it now imports into the United States, it comes in duty-free because it's the USMCA, previously NAFTA agreement, is part of that free trade agreement circumstance. So we have boots on the ground in Mexico. We moved a lot of companies in the last few years into Mexico, and it really is a very viable source. And you get all the benefits of a much closer to home manufacturing, so lower cost of transportation, and more control, less time in delay, and the exposure that's associated with delay.
Okay, and Tom, before you move on, I was just notified that the chat was disabled, but the Q&A function is available. So if you do have any questions of any of the content that Tom's covered so far, can you drop your question in the Q&A if you are unable to access the chat? All right, thank you, Tom.
Okay, no problem. So just a visual of the where the program exists. It's really a 50-mile swath of land that's along the Mexican border, and companies that locate in these areas get the benefit of the maquiladora. Having said that, we do have Mexican manufacturing outside this area, and the Mexican government has given exemptions to certain companies, even though they're not located in that specific designated area. It allows for manufacturing, assembly, and distribution. Obviously, the major benefits are duty and tax benefits. Under the USMCA, anything that's produced in Mexico that comes into the United States is under the free trade agreement. Okay, it lowers landed costs. Okay, and obviously becomes a friend and nearshoring option, and all the benefits that are associated with that. The United States has free trade agreements with numerous countries. The list of these countries are on this screen here. I want to highlight a few of these countries. Canada, we have moved a fair amount of manufacturing up to Canada. Canada is not a low-cost country, but when you eliminate the duty, it makes for an allowance for a little bit higher of an acquisition cost. And the transportation infrastructure is so well matured between Canada and the United States, it lowers the cost of transportation. Dominican Republic, which is in the middle there, we have a free trade agreement called the Caribbean Initiative, which they're part of. We found for all types of textiles, piece goods, leather goods, sportswear, sports equipment, all things like that. They have a huge manufacturing capability down there, a very low-cost manufacturing base, and they have a significant ability to develop workforce personnel. So they're a very viable location as well. Israel, I mentioned above, up until 3 weeks ago. Hopefully that situation will turn around and it'll then become a viable location. Mexico is on there. Korea, the Korea Free Trade Agreement has really spurred a tremendous amount of activity between the two countries. Korea has not what I'd say quite the manufacturing prowess as China has, but it's pretty close. And then Singapore as well is another country. Not so much relative to manufacturing, but I would say assembly and distribution. Singapore has presented a pretty good option for us over the years. So the free trade agreements that we outline there give us ease of import and export as goods move through the border from both countries. It eliminates the duties, and at the end of the day, it creates lower landed costs. When we do a search for a company looking to export its products overseas, we first go to free trade agreement countries to see what opportunity exists there. When we do sourcing alternatives, it's the first thing we turn to is free trade agreement countries as well, because they create a very viable and sustainable model because of that reduction and exposure relative to duties and taxes. Other countries that we've been very successful with, particularly in the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, is the Philippines, Poland. Poland has a very strong industrial capability. Brazil is very up and coming with their manufacturing capability. Vietnam is, a byproduct of China. A lot of Chinese companies have invested in Vietnam manufacturing. It's obviously very low cost labor, and a country obviously that we were at war with many years ago has now become an important ally for us in that part of the world. India, obviously, most of us know, is both a country that receives a significant amount of U.S. exports, and we also have a significant amount of manufacturing. A lot of companies that require really low cost manufacturing. India presents a great opportunity as compared to China. I would say that the only concern that we have generally with India is their transportation infrastructure is not as strong as it should be. It's not as mature as, say, a lot of the other countries that we have identified here. But they have made significant investments, and it does get better every day. Taiwan is obviously another place that a lot of manufacturing is done. It has a significant prowess, but we do have a high risk factor there because of all the rhetoric that's coming out of mainland China. Turkey is a huge manufacturer for Western Europe. Okay, it's not yet been really developed for American companies, so we are slowly moving some companies into Turkey, but we're finding that they provide a pretty quality product at a very competitive price. Malaysia has a manufacturing capability as well, mostly related to high-tech area, as does Ireland. Ireland, too, provides another opportunity for manufacturing, but mostly in that high-tech arena. So another thing to think about is the option of a foreign trade zone. So we move a fair amount of manufacturers that want to come back to the United States. We look at the opportunity to develop a foreign trade zone where they're going to do that manufacturing. The benefits of doing that is that when the goods pass through the border into that manufacturing location that's now a foreign trade zone, there's a deferral of the duties and taxes until the goods exit that facility. So if you have a 90-day, 120-day, 180-day turnaround in time, okay, you have a big cash flow advantage of not having to pay duties and taxes until it comes out of that facility. 3 years ago, we were using a 2.5% internal rate of return for a company in doing that ROI. Today, we're using a 12% return, internal rate of return. So the cash flow benefit is a pretty significant benefit today. In manufacturing, if we take in raw material components and parts and assemble or manufacture a new product, there's a potentially that we inverted the tariff, meaning that there's a different harmonized tariff for the product than the raw material or component. And it's likely that that newer product will come in at a lower duty rate than the raw material or component. Customs actually says in this case that you as the importer can declare whichever works better for you relative to cost. So they give you the ability to declare it as the raw material or component or as the finished product. If a certain percentage of your products are exported, say to Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, you're a Western Hemisphere distributor going all the way to Latin America, anything that's exported from that facility would not have any obligation to pay duties and taxes because the goods would never have entered the United States. That's really the big benefit of the foreign trade zone. While it geographically sits in the United States, it economically sits out of it. Customs says in a foreign trade zone will also allow you to do weekly activity, meaning that they don't want transactional reports as we do now as goods get imported and exported or come into the country. you can manifest all your activity, and let's just say you pick 5 o'clock on Friday, all your activity on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday gets accumulated and submitted into customs in this one manifest declaration. So it immediately reduces your customs clearance charges, okay, and also significantly reduces what's called your merchandise processing fees, which can be as high as $274 per transaction. We have a client in Houston that has 50 imports a week. They set up a foreign trade zone just for distribution, no manufacturing, and they only pay $274 once rather than 50 times, and they pay $125 for one clearance rather than paying $125 50 times a week. Their savings in their business model is close to $800,000 a year, okay, just by using a foreign trade zone to handle the weekly transactional clearances. And depending upon where you're located in the United States, there are a lot of local benefits, both at the county and the city level, as well as the state level, where if you open up foreign trade zones, they provide various economic benefits, such as deferral of taxes in certain cases. So in those locations, we can do manufacturing, assembly, fulfillment, distribution. We defer the duties. Exports, we eliminate the duties. We allow for tariff inversion to potentially occur, and they reduce clearance costs. And these are major issues that can be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of savings in your business models. So an example here, we worked with a company in San Diego. They're a tier 2 auto supplier, doing about $25 million of business, so it would be considered a small company. We switched their location to a foreign trade zone. They're importing parts and components and finishing the assembly in the United States rather than importing finished product. Okay. They have annual savings of $3.5 million, which is about 12-13% of their bottom line, against additional $125,000 of additional costs in managing the foreign trade zone. Another case for a larger company based in Philadelphia, doing $100 million worth of business, so we're moving the size of the company up. 100% of the sourcing was in China, now 20% from China, the balance from 2 free trade agreement countries and the United States, okay? So just moving them into that model where they're going into this free trade agreement countries, okay? They have annual savings of $1.7 million against $600,000 in costs. And those costs are only in the first year. They dissipate after the next year because they were tooling costs in setting up the 2 new countries where they were bringing product in from. So they dissipate over the course of time. So we highly recommend to companies that are involved in international trade, both as exporters and importers. It helps you access the benefits of all the programs that we talked about here. Is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. It's a voluntary program that's involved with security and compliance in your supply chain. And it really elevates your compliance profile with customs, okay? And it affords easy access to any of the government programs. And you get what we refer to as get out of jail free card, meaning that if you end up having an issue with the government, okay, you will have already mitigated your problem, okay, related to fine and penalty if you're a CTPAT member. So we have a bunch of these solutions to just kind of highlight. I have a little bit of time here, so I'm just going to talk a few of them. One of them is tariff engineering. So tariff engineering is the ability to specifically manipulate a product, okay, so that you can get benefit as it comes through the border. The best example of tariff engineering, we worked with a outdoor clothing company up in Seattle, and the company asked us to take a look at the supply chain to see where risk and cost could be potentially eliminated or reduced. So we looked at their line of clothing, and all their clothing was relative to outdoor activities, camping, sportswear, various outdoor hobbies, and so forth. And when you add a element to the clothing that waterproofs it, instead of it coming through the border anywhere from 3.5% to as much as 9% duty, okay, it eliminates the duty down to zero, such as adding Gore-Tex to the fabric. So this particular company, which was doing about $250 million worth of business, the additional cost of the Gore-Texing to their product added about $1.5 million of additional expense in the manufacturing process, but saved them close to $9 million a year in the duty and tax elimination area. And tariff engineering is the legitimate methodology used to manipulate the ingredients or how something is manufactured in order to get favor as it comes through the border. It's actually been tested 5 times with the Supreme Court, and in all cases, the importer won their case relative to that concept of tariff engineering. Another program that's listed here is Drawback. Drawback is a program where if a company imports something and now exports that product, they can go back to customs to claim back up to 99% of the duties and taxes paid. I specifically highlight this for exporters that might be listening to this program because Customs did an audit about 5 years ago, the General Accounting Office, and they determined that close to $50 billion was being left on the table of U.S. exporters that could be claiming drawback on goods that were actually imported. And you don't necessarily have to be the importer. You don't necessarily have to be the exporter. You just have to be able to evidence that the goods that you're exporting were actually imported and that you paid duties and taxes. Another point I'd like to make here is the demand planning area. When we go into a company, we analyze their freight billing and we look at how much money they spend on ocean freight versus air freight. And now there are certain commodities that air freight is a much better option, but generally over 90% of commodities can all be shipped by ocean freight. The difference in cost between air freight and ocean freight is 18 times, meaning that air freight is 18 times more expensive than ocean freight on a per kilo or per cubic meter view. Okay, so when we sit back and analyze a payable, and we see that a company is spending more than 5% of its freight spend in the area of air freight, that's too much. And when we analyze why is that, it usually relates right back to the demand planning process, that they're shipping goods because they've been late in their demand planning process, okay? And they have to rush things now from overseas here to the United States, or they have to rush things to a customer overseas. And it really comes down to a much tighter control over the information used in the demand planning process. And the last one that I'll emphasize here is the choice of Incoterm. For all of us involved in international business, Incoterms is a very critical area that we really need to make sure we understand very well and recognize that Incoterms change every 10 years. We're now dealing with the Incoterms that were created in 2020. There are 11 of them. We define Incoterms in the most simplest of concepts. It's a point in time in trade where the responsibility and liability, or cost and risk, are transferred from a seller to a buyer. Okay, I'm going to say that again. It's a point in time or trade, okay, where the cost and risk are transferred between a seller and a buyer. CIF, FOB, DDP, all those terminologies are used. So if it's this point in time where cost and risk, then it impacts cost and risk in the transaction, okay? And by manipulating the choice of the Incoterm, you therefore can manipulate your cost and risk in that transaction. And it's really a science all by itself, as much as an art all by itself, is what are the best Incoterms to utilize in your both export and your import sales. And that might be, I'll just mention to Tom and Shariah who are on this call, it might be another webinar that we may want to look at is, how do we leverage Incoterms in our overseas purchasing and in overseas export sales. So in summary, considering nearshoring as a risk management strategic plan is a very viable and timely issue. China should be a serious concern for both sourcing and business development. Most of that has to do with the political and economic rhetoric that's going on that does have some substance to it. Foreign trade zones, as I kind of outlined, is really a very viable option. And as I identified in the steps, this assessment process is something that everybody in supply chain should be really thinking about it. And we highly recommend that a third party be involved because you get an independent pair of eyes and experiences in evaluating and bringing to the table what other companies might be doing to the benefit of your organization. So there's value that's established, okay, in creating potentially more resilient and sustainable business model. It adds significant value to our national security. It reduces dependency on single foreign sources and opens up diversification in sourcing, and offers stability, demand planning, inventory management, and supply chain functions. And I can speak for having done this for 30 years, and particularly more intensely, say in the last 5 or 6 years, okay, that the concept of stability is clearly always established almost in every situation when we look to other alternative sources. And that maquiladora program in Mexico is really a friendshoring and nearshoring option, which really provides significant tax benefits to the manufacturing location down there, as well as the benefit of the companies that import and export to and from Mexico. So I want to appreciate NADEC for setting up this event, and I'll open it up to any questions that anybody might have and ask. My phone number and my email address is on this slide, so if you don't want to ask the question necessarily through the portal that's allowed here, you're welcome to come to me directly. So I thank Tom and Shariah and Heidi, and open it up for any questions anybody might have.
Yep. So thank you, Tom. I'm checking the Q&A. I know we had a couple of one question came in. They were trying to do the chat function, but no actual question about the content. So I think you did an excellent job, I guess, giving them all the information that they need on nearshoring and friendshoring. So thank you so much, Tom, for taking time out of your day to provide such good information to our participants today. And to all the participants, as you can see, that's Tom's information on the slide. Please make sure that you go to our website that was dropped in the chat by our host today. And also, you should also receive a link to the presentation as well. I think by Friday was the date that you'll get the recording, but the slides were provided to you via link. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you join us for our upcoming webinars. So check out our website to see what those are and when they will be presented. Thank you.